I have worked as a nurse in several hospitals and care facilities over the years. Before the hospital where I work now, I spent some time at a geriatric hospital located about 30 minutes from my home. I already had plenty of experience caring for elderly patients, so the job itself was nothing unfamiliar to me. At the time of this story, I had only been working there for a couple of weeks. Later you will understand why that was the case. The events happened during what would eventually become my second to last shift at that hospital, although I had no idea of that when the night began. I was assigned the graveyard shift, and I was running on almost no sleep. That night, I was responsible for the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in that section seemed to really enjoy having me around. Being a young woman in my 20s, among residents who spent most of their days lost inside fading memories, seemed to bring them a little comfort. Many of them appeared to see me as someone who connected them to the present moment. When someone with Alzheimer's is left alone, their thoughts can drift far away into other times and places. But when someone is interacting with them, even briefly, it helps anchor them to the current moment. I had several patients to care for that night, but one in particular was more restless than the others. Her name was Lena. It was my first time looking after her, and every time I entered the room, she would talk about the voices she claimed to hear. She also kept mentioning a man dressed entirely in black, standing in the corner of her room. The other patient who shared the room had already asked the staff before my shift to keep the curtain drawn between the beds, because Lena often spoke to her about these things, and it made her uncomfortable. Despite that, Lena was very sweet. Whenever she saw me, she would smile warmly. She did not talk much outside of those strange comments, and she was extremely forgetful, which was expected in that ward. I started my shift around 9 in the evening, and by 11, most of the patients had gone to sleep. Lena was not one of them. Each time she pressed the call button, and I walked into the room, she seemed frightened. She would whisper about the voices again, and point toward the corner where she said the man dressed in black was watching her. I will admit that hearing this repeatedly started to make me uneasy. I believed that inside her mind, these things were very real to her. Patients with Alzheimer's often experience confusion and hallucinations, and I felt sympathy for her, because if she truly believed she was seeing those things, it must have been terrifying. Still, my job was to comfort her and try to help her relax enough to sleep. I considered turning on the television to distract her, but I did not want to disturb the other patient in the room, who was already sleeping behind the curtain. Instead, I sat beside Lena and held her hands. I spoke softly and told her to take slow breaths and try to relax. I reassured her that she was safe and reminded her that I was right down the hallway if she needed anything. That seemed to help. After a little while, she calmed down, and when I checked on her later, she was finally asleep. Once the entire ward settles down for the night, the shift begins to feel incredibly slow. Time almost feels like it starts moving backwards. An hour or two passed. I was in the linen room restocking supplies on my cart. The room was small and completely silent. I had the door closed while I worked. That was why the sound I heard caught my attention. It was faint but clear enough to make me turn around. I looked across the room but saw nothing. Thinking I might have imagined it, I went back to organizing the linens. Then I suddenly felt something on my shoulder. The sensation was unmistakable. It felt like a large hand resting firmly there. I looked down at my shoulder immediately and jumped back with a scream. There was nothing there. No one was in the room with me. Yet I was absolutely certain I had felt something touch me. My heart was racing as I stepped into the hallway and looked around. There were no other nurses nearby, and the corridor was completely quiet. I had no real explanation for what had just happened, so after a moment, I forced myself to go back into the linen room and finish what I was doing. I continued filling my cart until it was fully stocked. Once I was done, I turned toward the door. The moment I looked up, my entire body froze. Standing outside the door, staring through the small glass window, was a man dressed in black. He was smiling. The sight shocked me so badly that my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the floor. I began screaming at the top of my lungs. As I watched through the glass, the man slowly moved out of view. My screams echoed through the ward. Within seconds, the door swung open and one of the other nurses rushed inside. She helped me up from the floor while I struggled to breathe. I immediately asked her if she had seen the man dressed in black standing outside the door. She looked confused and said she had not seen anyone. According to her, there was nobody else in that hallway. We quickly checked every room in the ward, but there was no sign of anyone wearing black or anyone unfamiliar in the area. The noise I made had woken several patients, including Lena. When I entered her room again, she immediately began talking about the voices. This time, she also mentioned hearing screams. She did not know that the screams had come from me. Trying to steady my voice, I asked her something. I asked if the man she kept seeing was dressed in black and if he was smiling. She stared at me for a moment. Then I noticed something change in her expression. Her eyebrows lowered and her face suddenly looked more focused than I had seen all night. She quietly asked me one question. "How did you know?" Even though my heart was already racing, I felt it skip as soon as she said that. Almost immediately, Lena started screaming. She kept shouting that he was coming and begging to be taken out of the room. Other nurses rushed in and tried to calm her down. After that incident, the supervisor moved me to another ward for the rest of the night, so I would not have to go back into that room. Eventually, I ended up going home early because I was still completely shaken by what had happened. The next day, I sent a message to the head nurse. I told her that my upcoming shift would be my final one. I explained that the experience had scared me badly and that I did not feel comfortable returning to that building. She replied kindly and said she understood. I have never been diagnosed with any condition that causes hallucinations, and nothing like that had ever happened to me before. I know that extreme exhaustion can affect the mind, and I was definitely sleep-deprived that night. Still, what I experienced felt far beyond simple fatigue. The feeling of a hand on my shoulder, the image of the smiling man outside the door, and the fact that it matched the description a patient had repeated all night. All of it together created something I still cannot explain. It remains one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. And honestly, I hope it is the only time I ever encounter something like that. 3 years ago, I ended up with bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida, and as far as I know, there was no outbreak happening at the time. Because of that, I have no idea how I caught it or where it came from. The symptoms started hitting me pretty hard. I had terrible headaches, confusion, constant sleepiness, nausea, and I completely lost my appetite. But when the hallucinations began, that was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. One afternoon I was lying in bed feeling extremely sick while my husband was at work when I heard a child's voice from downstairs call out, "Mom, Mom." The problem was that we do not have any children. I forced myself out of bed and slowly walked to the top of the stairs, trying to look down while calling my husband's name. There was no response, of course, since he was still at work. Standing up made the pounding in my head much worse, so I went back to bed. Not long after that, I heard another voice from downstairs. This time it simply said, "Hello, hello." At that point, I grabbed my phone and called my husband. I was panicking and telling him through the phone that I could hear a child's voice somewhere inside the house and that I thought I might be hallucinating. He could hear how scared I was, so he left work early to come home and take me to the hospital. While I waited for him to arrive, I changed out of my pajamas. While doing that, I suddenly had to rush to the bathroom because I felt like I was about to throw up. While I was in the middle of vomiting, I heard another voice just outside the bathroom door. I could not make out what it said, and I could not tell if it sounded like the same voice from earlier. At that point, I honestly felt like I was losing my mind. I was not officially diagnosed until I got to the hospital, where the doctors told me that untreated bacterial meningitis can be extremely serious and sometimes even fatal. One of the doctors explained that the hallucinations I experienced were somewhat unusual, but still possible with my condition. Not long after arriving, I was given antibiotics through a needle. The doctor also told me that I was lucky I came in as quickly as I did, because waiting longer could have caused permanent damage or even death. My husband stayed in the hospital room with me for several hours. The staff explained that because of how severe my symptoms were, I would need to stay there for several days, possibly up to a week. Around 10 o'clock that night, my husband left to go home since he had to work the next day. Before leaving, the nurse told me to call her if I needed anything. Even though I still felt absolutely miserable, I fell asleep fairly quickly. At some point, I started having a dream where my ex-husband was standing next to my hospital bed, leaning over me and talking. He was saying awful things about my current husband. He gently patted my head and said he was glad I was okay and that he came as soon as he saw my husband leave. Then he started going on about how much he hated my husband and how he wanted to kill him. While speaking, he kept rubbing my forehead, and eventually he walked out of the room. I sometimes have disturbing dreams about my ex-husband because our marriage was extremely toxic and abusive, which is why it ended. I would rather not go into details about that. Eventually, I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. I looked around the room and noticed that a chair had been pulled right up next to my hospital bed. No one was sitting in it, but I knew it had not been there when my husband left earlier. Since it was still the middle of the night, I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning I woke up when the nurse came into the room. I mentioned the strange and very vivid dream I had about my ex-husband. She laughed at first and said that it was not a dream. According to her, my cousin had come to visit me the night before. I immediately told her that I do not have any cousins who live anywhere near this state. Her expression quickly changed, and she looked more serious. She then explained that someone had come in late the previous night and told the staff he was my cousin named David. David happens to be the name of my ex-husband. After I explained the situation more clearly, the nurse brought a doctor into the room. The doctor told me that the antibiotics could have caused delirium, which can make it difficult for someone to tell the difference between sleeping and being awake. According to him, that could explain why I believed I was dreaming while hearing David speak. I called my husband and told him everything that had happened. Naturally, he was furious and very concerned, so he came back to the hospital again that evening after work. Earlier that same day, I sent David a text asking what he thought he was doing by visiting me, and how he even knew I was in the hospital. My message showed that it was delivered, but he ignored it at first. I sent another message telling him that I heard the threats he made about my husband, and that I was considering contacting the police. A few minutes later, he finally responded. He wrote that he never threatened my husband at all. According to him, he was only there because he heard that I was sick and wanted to make sure I was okay. He claimed that I must have misunderstood what I heard while half asleep. I replied by telling him to stay out of my life, or I would involve the police again. After that, he never answered. I never told my husband about the threats I thought I heard that night, because I truly do not know whether they were real. Considering the antibiotics and the hallucinations I was already experiencing earlier, it is entirely possible that my mind twisted what actually happened. But at the same time, I cannot say for certain that it did. About a week later, I was finally discharged from the hospital. I once matched with a girl on Tinder named Francesca, and we actually stayed friends long after that first meeting. Right away, she seemed interesting. She had a full sleeve of tattoos covering her left arm, red streaks in her hair, and her profile mentioned that she loved working out. One of the photos on her profile showed her standing on the rooftop of a tall building with an amazing view behind her. I asked her where that picture was taken. She told me it was the roof of an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town that was supposedly incredible to explore at night. According to her, it was really easy to sneak inside. There was usually a police officer driving around the massive parking lot to discourage people from trespassing, but she claimed it was simple to avoid being seen. She suggested that we go there together for our first date, if you could even call it a date. I thought it sounded awesome. She seemed cool, and meeting someone that way felt way more interesting than the usual plan of grabbing drinks somewhere. I picked her up from her house, which was only about 10 minutes away, and then we drove about 20 minutes to reach the hospital. During that drive, we talked a lot and got comfortable with each other pretty quickly. When we arrived, she told me to park on a quiet dead-end street, hidden behind a wall of tall bushes. From there, it was about a 5-minute walk to the building itself. We hopped over a small barrier separating the street from the hospital property, and then ran across the huge empty parking lot toward a patch of grass near the entrance she normally used. She guided us to a shattered basement window that served as her usual entry point. The place already gave off a creepy feeling, but I had signed up for the adventure. I was glad I had worn the old jeans she recommended, because it was obvious they were going to get snagged on something. The only lights we had were the flashlights on our phones. We had not brought any powerful gear or anything like that. Francesca moved through the building like she knew every corner of it. She led us through the basement and up to a stairway that went to the higher floors. I will admit that standing inside a massive abandoned hospital at night with only one other person was already pretty unsettling. I just did not realize how much worse things were about to get. Once we reached the first floor, Francesca kept talking in a normal voice that felt way too loud in the silence. I kept thinking someone might hear us. Suddenly, down the hallway we were standing in, there was a sound like a door opening or closing. The noise echoed straight toward us. She heard it too, and immediately stopped talking. I whispered and asked if it was normal for other people to be there. She said sometimes it happened, but not very often. We both shut off our flashlights and stood still. A loud bang suddenly echoed through the corridor, much closer than before. We both panicked and rushed through the darkness. I followed behind her, even though I could barely see anything. We made it back to the stairway and ran up the steps with our lights turned back on. After climbing a couple floors higher, we finally slowed down and started talking again. Francesca said the police never came inside the building, so it was probably just other people exploring. The strange part was that we had not seen any flashlights in that hallway. Nobody normal would be walking around a place like that in complete darkness. Then we heard another sound echoing from the stairwell we had just used. Someone was coming up the stairs. We panicked again. She said she knew another way and started running. We hurried through a confusing maze of hallways and rooms. At that point, I was genuinely terrified. It really felt like someone was chasing us, and I was not sure whether I would prefer it to be the police or some random stranger. After several minutes of running, she led us out onto a small outdoor section of the building. It was not the main rooftop, but more like the roof of a lower level. We stopped there to catch our breath. The idea that someone might still be following us completely ruined the mood. Even Francesca seemed uneasy now, and I had been relying on her as the person who knew this place best. After a few minutes, we relaxed a little. Then we climbed through a broken window that led into the ceiling area above a large room. This part was nerve-wracking because she wanted to walk across long, narrow wooden planks with about a 10-foot drop beneath us. Falling from that height would definitely hurt, but I did not want to look weak. I carefully followed her across one long board until we reached the top of a large pillar where one plank ended and another one began. We sat down on the pillar and hung our legs over the edge while talking quietly and looking down into the darkness below. The room felt eerie and empty. At least that is what I thought until we heard movement underneath us. It sounded like someone walking on the floor below. Since whoever was down there probably already knew we were around, We turned on our flashlights and pointed them downward. Standing directly below us at the base of the pillar was a man who looked to be in his 40s. He was wearing a black Carhartt beanie, a black jacket, and black sweatpants. He stared up at us with a strange smile on his face. In a deep, unsettling voice he said, "Come on down," while motioning with his hand for us to climb down. I asked him if he was a police officer. He ignored my question completely, as if I had not even spoken. Still smiling, he repeated the same thing. "Come on down." Francesca and I stood up immediately and started moving back across the narrow board. My fear of falling was even worse now, because I had no idea what that guy might do if he reached us. Halfway across the plank, we saw him hurry out of the room below through a doorway. He was clearly going to try to intercept us. We rushed across the rest of the board and started running through the building again. We headed down a stairwell on the opposite side of the hospital. While we were racing down the steps, we suddenly heard a door several floors above slam open, followed by heavy footsteps pounding down the stairs. Somehow he had managed to follow us. We ran as fast as we could. It honestly felt like we were running for our lives. Eventually, we made it back to the first floor and sprinted to the side of the building where we had entered earlier. We went down to the basement and climbed back out through the broken window. Getting through that window was terrifying, because I climbed out second. For a moment I thought someone might grab my legs from inside. Luckily by then it seemed like we had lost him. We ran across the huge parking lot straight to my car. The moment we got inside, we locked the doors and sat there breathing hard. The whole experience had been a nightmare. But strangely enough, going through something like that together created an instant connection between us. We drove away from the hospital and ended up stopping at a Wendy's so we could eat and calm down. We sat in the car talking for about an hour before I finally drove her home. Francesca and I kept in touch after that night. We actually dated for a few months, but eventually we realized we were better off as friends. One thing we both agreed on, though: neither of us ever went back to that hospital again.